feeling a flock here to the mountainside. The fields are so sitting all alone, feeling a flock here to the mountainside. The shepherds left and you're not sure. I am thine only son, sent down from heaven, mankind to taste and sign, sent down
Hello everybody, it's now January 2021, darkest days of winter, and at the moment unfortunately still no prospect of singing together in person, but we're looking forward to that day coming when we can start to rehearse properly again. In the meantime, it's a good opportunity for us to learn as much as we can about our choral singing, so that when we can get together, we're able to do it even better than before. Might have to scrape a bit of rust off the vocal cords, but understanding what we're trying to do can be a big part of enjoying better the music that we do and the way we deliver it to our audiences. One of the things that we particularly like in the Kemsing Singers is the sheer variety of music that we do. And we tend to do shorter pieces rather than the great big choral numbers. And that enables us to do music from just about every period. And understanding a bit more about the workings of music from different periods and what the composers are trying to do and why the music sounds the way it does and technically how we should approach it. All of that means that we can enjoy much more what we're doing and just make a better job of it. Let's start with a bit of terminology, because I think it does help to understand a few of the words that we choral directors bandy around from time to time. And we start in this period with essentially music that can be split into two types, secular and sacred. And at this time, it was pretty much never the twain shall meet. So the secular music was the music of dance and song. And it was the music that wasn't all that much changed from medieval times, the music that was performed in the taverns, in the marketplaces, in the home, and a lot of it was based on very old dance forms, very energetic, often lively rhythms, and songs that were handed down to suit different occasions, different times of year. And quite a lot of the carols that we sing come from that tradition, and you can still trace some of the styles of that kind of music in folk music, traditional folk music that's still played today. So an emphasis on pipes and drums and flutes and fiddles, and people just generally playing and singing along and having a good time. People weren't too troubled either as to whether they sang music or played it. It was pretty much interchangeable. You just performed with whoever and whatever you happened to have to hand. It was rather different in the case of sacred music. This was the music performed in the churches, in the cathedrals, in the monasteries. That was very much about the liturgy set to music. So you have predominantly settings of the Mass, and you have shorter pieces called motets, which would often take a little bit of Bible text and set it to music. And then you have, on the secular side, pieces called madrigals, and a lot of choirs will have some madrigals at least in their repertoire. Now, madrigals are essentially songs, part songs. Often they are settings of poems about love, about courtship, about birth and death. They are typically the subjects that still pervade popular music today. But madrigals are a little bit different in that they tend to have been written by court composers, by composers who know what they're doing with considerable amount of skill, and they will set the great poets of the time, and they were often madrigals that were there to flatter their patron in some way. There are quite a lot that make oblique references to Queen Elizabeth I herself. Fair Oriana is one of the names that crops up in madrigals written in her honour. And madrigals, while they are secular, it's probably worth thinking of them more in terms of pieces by Rutter or Carl Jenkins, Howard Goodall. Yes, they cover popular subjects, and yes, they are written to appeal in a more popular way than the sacred music, but they're written by composers who have studied the art of composing, and they are quite unlike the kinds of music that would have been sung by more ordinary mortals in the taverns, in the towns, in the home. Let's just listen to a bit of a motet followed by a bit of a madrigal that musically sound very similar. They're both lively, they're both rhythmical, they're both four-part choir, and it's really only the text that is the difference between one being a motet and one being a madrigal. The motet is one that we're going to look at in more detail anyway, and that's I Sing to the Lord Alway by Redford. And you'll hear that with a lively exposition of the main tune. And let's compare that with a madrigal by John Farmer that's quite well known, Fair Phyllis I Saw Sitting All Alone. Musically, you'll hear a lot of the same distinctive aspects to the style, which we'll cover in a bit more detail. But one is a madrigal, Fair Phyllis, which is a bit of a love story, and the motet, I Sing to the Lord Alway, which is based on a biblical text. Let's get under the bonnet a bit and see what's distinctive about this style of music. The music's still based on the old modes, but increasingly it's settling into keys that we recognise as major and minor. What are modes, I hear you say? Essentially, they're old scales that most easily equate to just the white notes of the piano. So if I start on a C, just the white notes is very recognisable as a modern major scale. If I go from D to D just on white notes, . sounds a bit minorish, but it's not quite as we would recognise it. If I go from E to E on white notes, different again. It might be clearer to hear how different those are from our modern scales if I play Bar Bar Black Sheep. Let me play it on F, which would have been called the Lydian mode, F to F, the equivalent of that pattern of white notes. And Bar Bar Black Sheep sounds perfectly normal for the most part. It's just one note that's adrift from a modern scale. That one, the B natural, sounds wrong in there. So to make a major scale, it became flattened eventually to a B flat. So F major has just a B flat in it, and then all is well. B flat. So that's it, touching on the difference between the older modes and the modern major and minor scales, and why we have different keys and key signatures now. So what was happening in this period is they were starting to transition from the old modes into our more modern and recognisable major and minor scales, but it was still pretty flexible. And you start to see some sharps and some flats creeping in. And you see some of them in brackets as well when you're in your printed music, where an editor is just suggesting that perhaps a change here sounds better than leaving it as something else. And this sprinkling in of sharps and flats and naturals, they're known as accidentals. They're tucked in, not in an opening key signature, which is what we're used to. Now, if we take a closer look at a motet that we're going to learn in a bit more detail, we can start to see what I mean about this still rather flexible approach to major and minor. So we're having a look at Nolo, mortem, peccatoris by Thomas Morley. We can start to see and hear how these accidentals, these extra sharps, naturals, flats, whatever, are brought into play as it switches fairly easily in between major and minor sounds. So let me remind you of what it sounds like. So that's the first section of it, and the rather repeating chorus of it. So it starts off sounding very much in E minor, and the soprano melody. And if we put in the alto underneath, now they're already in the alto part. You have a D natural there, and then sharps. If you listen with the soprano in there, D natural, D sharp, C starts to sound different at the end of that very first phrase. Now the bass part comes in at that point, and we've had the D sharp, C sharp in the alto. When the bass starts, you might think it's going to go to a C sharp, same as the alto has done, but it doesn't. It's got one of these suggested notes in brackets, where the editor is suggesting that because it's a downward movement, it would probably have fallen back from the natural. Rather than doing so if I play the alto part and then that bass part, you might hear that sudden shift. What we might have expected. If we go on with this on the bottom line, the altos are asked to shift from their D sharps that they've had to peccatoris, and that in the context of it starts to shift us feeling more major. So I'm going to go back to the beginning with just the soprano and the alto, very much E minor feel. And we start to feel a little bit more bright and majorish there, I think, in the soprano. Sounds very much like a fairly normal major, but if I put the bottom line together with all the other parts, hey ho, it still remains rather minor. And then the last phrase. Sung now and see if you can hear just those little subtle shifts of major minor feel. So I hope that illustrates the importance of really noticing the accidentals when we're performing music in this style and pitching our notes with accuracy as they flex in and out of keys as we would know them in our modern times. The next feature worth noting in Renaissance music is that the intervals of a fourth and a fifth are really still quite dominant. And we looked at intervals and what it means in, I think it was episode 5 in our autumn term virtual season, if you want to go back and remind yourself. Fourths and fifths are known as perfect intervals. They're naturally found in nature in the acoustic properties of sound. The drone notes of ancient bagpipes and strings reflect those natural harmonics. And human voices are also naturally set about a fourth or a fifth apart. If you think of a low male voice, the bass, and a high male voice, the tenor, their ranges are roughly in that juxtaposition of a fifth. The difference between the bottom of a tenor and the bottom of an alto is also about a fifth, and similarly the lowest notes of sopranos and altos, they tend to be in that same sort of register and separation. Have a listen to this medieval piece by Guillaume de Machaut, which demonstrates how earlier music, the earliest attempts at harmony, were really based around these natural fourths and fifths. And this excerpt is played on instruments but could just as easily be sung by voices. And I hope you can hear how the parts quite naturally fall into layers that are roughly in these fourth and fifth juxtapositions. Let's look now at our other piece for today, Rejoice in the Lord Alway, which has been attributed to John Redford. It's a joyful motet, or anthem because it's English. It's based on rising fourths and a very jaunty rhythm. So the opening soprano line starts like this. So you've got these rising fourths. Rejoice, and the next one, in the Lord, and another one, and again, and this lively little rhythm that crosses over the bars. That's why it's been bracketed together. Rejoice in the Lord alway, and again I say rejoice. And that same lively tune based on these rising fourths is in the other parts as well. So the alto does something similar just a beat later. Rejoice in the Lord alway, and again I say rejoice. And the tenor then gets it. Rejoice in the Lord alway, and again I say rejoice, exactly as the soprano had it. And the basses finally get their go. Rejoice in the Lord alway, and again I say rejoice. So it's the lively melody, lively rhythm, much more like the Fair Phyllis Madrigal that we heard earlier than the more solemn Nolo, mortem, peccatoris. So this affects how we sing it as well. He's chosen, if indeed John Redford did this, these rising fourths because they're exactly like leaping in the air for joy. And I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the feature of Renaissance music, where they painted the words. It was called word painting. They tried to directly represent some of the words in the music. So this rising forth is a leap in the air. Rejoice! And if we sing it in a fairly smooth legato way, as we sang the previous motet, rejoice in the Lord alway, and again I say rejoice. Completely and utterly different feel, and in most people's view, a wrong feel. We've got to treat this lower note as our springboard. If you can remember what it was like to jump, you would bend your knees beforehand in order to spring up, and then that very act of springing would mean you would land a little bit more heavily on the step or whatever it is you've jumped up onto, and we have to get that exact feel into our voices. So we bounce on the lower note, re, re, preferably with a good R sound on the front of it as well, because that helps, and then we hit the next joy quite hard. Rejoy, rejoy. So we get that exact bang effect of jumping in the air or in the alto. Rejoy, rejoy. And we've got to keep that bounce going on these other rising fourths as well. So we get rejoice in the Lord alway, and again, there's another one, and again. So rejoice in the Lord alway, and again I say rejoice, and again I say rejoice. It's got to have that energy and that bounce. Let's have a listen to some of that. Now, this feature that I just mentioned, word painting, it's another strong element of the period, and you find it in madrigals in particular, where they can have a lot of fun with the words. And if we go back to Fair Phyllis for a moment, we can get a good example of it. There's a little bit in it where the words are up and down he wandered, and this phrase that is used is tossed around between the voices in a rather helter-skelter fashion, so we literally get a picture in our minds of Amyntas trying to find his fair Phyllis. Up and down he wandered. Have a listen. The last elements that we're going to take a look at in this trip through some Renaissance vocal music are imitation and polyphony. They're arguably the most important and most recognisable aspects of this style at this time. They don't mean the same thing, but you could say that imitation is what gives rise to a polyphonic texture in very many cases. So let's take imitation first. The most familiar use of imitation is in what we call a round or a canon, to give it its official name. The kinds of simple songs that we sang as children, where one part follows another part exactly. And you have things like Three Blind Mice is a good example of a round, where there's strict imitation. One voice copies exactly what the other voice has done. And it is that very copying with a delay in it that sets up some layers of harmony. Let's just for the fun of it have a go at one of my favourite perversions of Three Blind Mice. I think might be the best way to describe it. Those of you that came to our March workshop the last time we sang together, you might remember this one.
Three blind mice, three blind mice, three blind mice, three blind days, sleep on the front, sleep on the front, sleep on the front, sleep on the front, shout things, shout things.
So that's an exact imitation. The layers are built up by copying, same pitch, same rhythm, exactly. Now, polyphony literally means many sounds. Now, this is many sounds, but it's not polyphony. So it's probably better to think in terms of it meaning many layers. It's about the density of the music, the texture of the music, how many things are going on simultaneously, and in what way are they doing that. So polyphony is a bit like drifts of stitches in something like a carpet or a tapestry or a piece of fine cloth. And looked at close to, you can see those lines of stitching and colour. And it's when you step back from it that you start to see the whole pattern or the whole image. Polyphony is like that. Each part is independent and it forms its own position in time and space. And so you get quite a complex layering of these ideas, and it's for the listener to step back and to hear the whole of those voice parts or instrumental parts forming together. Returning to our Redford anthem, the four parts enter in turn. The tumbling in one after the other in imitation, and they're not doing an exact imitation as we did with our Three Blind Mice. They are coming in and starting at different intervals, and you've guessed it, yes, they're coming in fourths or fifths. Rejoice in the Lord alway, and again I say rejoice. Alto comes in on their version of it. The tenor gets a go, and the tenor is coming in a fourth below where the alto was. And when the bass gets a go, it starts a fifth below where the tenor started. Now, because they're not exact copies, the parts get to be extended and elongated in a variety of ways. And that leads into something about how we should approach performing music like this. It's very important that the ear hears those different entries coming in, those initial imitations. But if everybody sang at the same volume throughout, it would be really just a mush, particularly as so much of this music was written for cathedrals and churches, where the echo and reverberation tends to give you a mush anyway. So it's very important that we emphasise the opening imitations and then back off a bit when we're on our more extended section, so that the next voice part, the next imitation, can have its moment. So if I was singing the soprano here, I would start firmly. Rejoice in the Lord alway, and again I say rejoice. But I would need to quieten down a bit so that, for example, the tenor can be heard coming in. And again I say rejoice. If I was on the alto part, I would start very strongly. Rejoice in the Lord alway, and again I say rejoice, and then back off a little bit there so that the lower parts can have their moment. So it's very important when you're singing music of this period, you're on your own line. Your line is everybody's important as everybody else's. They're all equal. But you have to be listening to who's doing what where, and come forward when you've got the important bit, back off a bit when it's somebody else's turn. Let's listen to a bit of that in action. Now, on page 3, something rather different happens. We have new words, let your moderation be known unto all men. And here, quite suddenly, all the voices come together at the same point and with the same rhythm. And this gives us quite a different texture, and it's a texture that's called a homophonic texture. Same sounds at the same time. It can also be referred to as chordal writing, like chords. Let me just play that bit to you from the top of page 3. Now, the fact that that suddenly comes together in a homophonic style at that point serves two purposes. Firstly, the words become very clear because they're all being spoken at the same time. And secondly, it calms us down from all that leaping around that we've been doing in the previous part, and makes us more reflective. You might also notice, the observant among you, that we've got another bit here with some of these accidentals creeping in that are kicking us in between the keys a little bit. So we start with F natural, F sharp, then F natural in the men again, and then F sharp, and then on the repeat of the words, back comes the F natural again, and it moves higher. And it also moves into what feels like a much more major key. So the repeat of the words is more uplifting. imitations then return and the full polyphonic texture continues really through to the end of the piece. So let's finish by hearing that piece right through, and you can either join in with your part or you can just sit back and let the beauty of the music wash over you.
Rejoice,